In this video, I wanted to talk about alveoli and their structure. So I'm going to start off where we left off, the bronchiole. And eventually these bronchioles are going to get smaller and smaller, right? So let's say that this bronchiole right here is the smallest it gets, right? And this will lead directly into the alveoli. Okay, so there are going to be multiple. I'll just draw the alveoli right like this. Okay. And when it comes in like this, I'll do my best to draw this. It's going to cut off into several alveolar sacs. So multiple will fill this sort of cluster of alveoli. And these alveolar sacs will lead off into several alveoli. And don't be confused by the border that I drew. I just did that to make it clear that the alveolar sac is different than the alveoli. So really what it would look like is just one sac leading off. So it would really look like this. This would be the sac right here, and then these would be the alveoli. So there would be no border. I just did that to make it clear. And this right here would be an alveolar duct. Okay. Yeah, so it would be an alveolar duct. And that's just sort of the duct that leads off and is that just leads off into the alveolar sacs. Okay, so let's actually get into the alveoli, right? So oxygen is going to come in, it's going to go through the alveolar duct, into the alveolar sac, and then into the alveoli, right? Now, what are these alveoli actually going to look like? Let's make some space. So let's just draw three cells that are part of the alveolar wall. So just like this. Okay. And this is going to be the inside of the alveoli. And this alveolar wall that I drew, it's actually only going to be one cell thick. So yeah, it's only going to be one cell thick, and that's actually to help with diffusion, which we'll talk about later on, but it helps with the diffusion of oxygen into the blood flow and carbon dioxide back. The alveolar wall is going to consist of two types of cells. Type 1 alveolar cells, and that's what the left and the right one look like. So the left cell and the right cell are the type 1 alveolar cells, and then this would be a type 2 alveolar cell. Type 2 alveolar cell. Okay. So the difference is that basically type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells, they basically form a very thin membrane on the alveoli, for the alveoli. Or not a membrane, a wall, a thin wall for the alveoli. Yeah. But the difference is that type 2 alveolar cells actually have lamellar bodies, okay? Or lamellar bodies, and they are going to produce surfactant, okay? Surfactant that will actually line the outside of these alveolar cells, and that is going to reduce surface tension. Also, that's pretty important because there is going to be water that is coating your alveoli. So right where I drew the surfactant, that's where water is going to be. And if there's high surface tension, then that water is going to want to near itself. It will want to be near itself. And that means that those little water molecules that make up that body of water coating the alveoli are going to want to be near each other. And if they coat the alveolar wall and they want to be near each other, then in order to be near each other, they're going to need to make the alveolar wall smaller or shorter. Right? So there will always be a force that is pulling that alveolar wall to become shorter. And that will make that the alveolus itself smaller. And when you're breathing out and there's already a force making the alveolus smaller, if there's also surface tension that's making the alveolus smaller, then the alveolus could collapse on itself. So, your type 2 alveolar cells produce surfactant to decrease surface tension and prevent this from happening. Type 2 alveolar cells also move water between blood flow and also the inside of your alveoli. And they also help in the case where you tear your alveoli and you need to repair it, they also help with the repair. Type 1 alveolar cells help with the structure, and obviously they're very important to maintaining just the overall function of alveoli, which is to move oxygen to and from the blood, right? Or oxygen to the blood and CO2 away from the blood, because they make up a large portion of the surface area of the alveoli. Okay, so how is oxygen going to get out into the blood flow? So if this, I'll redraw it because I don't have any space to draw the blood flow. This is our blood flow, and this is our alveoli. By the way, these cells don't make up the full alveolar wall. These are just some of the cells that I'm drawing. If you ever need to look up a picture or a diagram, I recommend going to Khan Academy. Now there are going to be some red blood cells. Okay, and you might be wondering what's the mechanism behind the oxygen, right? Oxygen going to the red blood cells. Diffusion, actually. So diffusion is basically the movement of molecules from high concentration to low concentration. So generally, if you have lots of particles in one area, and then not so many in this area, they're going to want to go in that direction. And that's what happens here. Your alveoli keep this sort of gradient so that there's really high oxygen here and not as high oxygen over here. And that will make it so that the oxygen will want to constantly flow to your red blood cells. So that's the mechanism behind the oxygen going from the alveoli to the red blood cells. And the red blood cells have hemoglobin, and oxygen will bind to that hemoglobin and will be carried to wherever it is needed in your body. Okay, so diffusion is how oxygen goes from the inside of the alveoli to the red blood cells. Another thing worth mentioning is that the brush cells that we mentioned earlier are also part of the alveoli. And they're actually just meant to, they're very occasional, so they're not as, they're not as prominent as the alveolar cells, but they still are there. And they send signals to the brain to inform the brain of air quality in your alveoli. Okay, so it will have like a little nerve, afferent nerve. Okay. Yeah. So just to conclude, alveoli. There are two types of cells. Type 2 alveolar cells and type 1 alveolar cells. And they make up the walls of the alveoli. And they are only one cell thick, so that diffusion can happen really easily. So you can imagine it would be more difficult for diffusion to happen if there were it was 10 cells thick, right? And type 2 alveolar cells produce surfactant to reduce surface tension and prevent alveoli from collapsing on themselves. And this surfactant is produced by these lamellar bodies. Sorry, I'll write it out. Lamellar bodies. And they will produce surfactants that will line the alveolar wall. And then oxygen will be able to go to red blood cells via diffusion and bind to hemoglobin, where they will be taken to your cells. Okay, I think that pretty much concludes this video. Uh, Thank you.